In this session, we're going to transition from simply summarizing data, descriptive statistics, to drawing conclusions from data, inferential statistics. We want to be able to answer questions like, what's the obesity rate in the United States? Or how much more effective would our customer service representatives be if they all received this empathy training? Questions for which it's impractical or impossible to collect data on every person of interest. We want to make the best conclusions and decisions based on limited information, and we'll use probability to describe our confidence in our conclusions. So far, we've been talking about probabilities of observable events. For example, if we have a bag with 3 red marbles in it and 1 blue marble, how plausible is it that we get a blue marble when we reach into the bag without looking? But what if we have limited information? Suppose that we only know that there are 4 marbles in the bag. Some are red and some are blue, but we don't know how many of each. Can we determine the composition of the bag based on what we draw out? It may seem a little artificial to talk about figuring out the composition of the bag in this way. Why don't we just open the bag and take a look to get a definitive answer? Certainly, if we were really talking about a bag of marbles, that would be the most sensible approach. But the bag of marbles is really a simple analogy for real-life cases in which it's impossible to look in the bag, so to speak. We have to be able to draw conclusions about the obesity rate in the United States without measuring the weight of every single resident. That is, we draw a few U.S. adults from the bag, and based on their weights, we have to come to a sensible conclusion about the obesity rate for the entire population. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the simple exercise of determining the composition of the bag of marbles without looking inside. The first step is to think about all the possible compositions of the bag. There could be all red marbles, 1 blue, 2 blue, 3 blue, or all blue marbles. These 5 possibilities form the outcome space for the question, what's in the bag? Previously, when we were thinking about the outcome space, we were focused on outcomes that we could observe. But in this case, we're thinking about hypothetical outcomes. In other words, if we were able to open up the bag, what are the possible outcomes that we would see in terms of its contents? We could call each of these hypothetical bags a model. A model is a simplified representation of the world, one of several possible scenarios. In our example, the little sliver of the world that we're interested in is this mysterious bag of marbles, and we're representing that piece of the world with the number of red and blue marbles. Note that the models are a simplification of reality. Our models only include the number of red and blue marbles. We're ignoring the size of the marbles, whether they're made of glass or plastic, how heavy they are, exactly what shade of red and blue they are, and so on. In our model, we only care about the number of red and blue marbles, nothing else about the world. Moreover, we have 5 different models we're considering. Each of the 5 models is one of several possible scenarios we could find if we were to open up the bag. So we have our mysterious bag of marbles, and we have 5 models for what the bag could contain. Before we discover anything more about this bag of marbles, do we have any reason to believe that one of these hypothetical bags is more likely to represent the real bag than any of the others? Probably not. In the absence of more information, each of the models is equally plausible. Our beliefs about the contents of the bag follow a uniform distribution. This distribution is called a prior. A prior distribution tells us the plausibility of each model before observing any data. Usually our prior distribution will not strongly favor one model more than another. We call that a vague prior. But sometimes we can use background information to make the prior more specific. For example, is it at all plausible that the average height of U.S. adults could be 10 feet tall? Not at all. Even before starting to measure adults, we believe that some models of the average U.S. height, say those models in the 4 to 6 foot range, are more plausible than other models, like a 10-foot model. And we can choose a prior distribution that reflects this background knowledge. Similarly, we could use results from previous research to inform our prior beliefs for the next research study. That is, if we found that the obesity rate was 15% in 1990, we might find obesity rates in the 10 to 40% range more plausible in 2015 than obesity rates in the 70 to 90% range. Returning to our example, we can think about the probability of drawing out a red or blue marble for each of our hypothetical bags. If the bag contains 1 blue marble, the probability of drawing out a blue marble is 25%. But if the bag contains 2 blue marbles, the probability of drawing out a blue marble is 50%. These conditional probability distributions are called the likelihood. The likelihood is the probability of each outcome given one of the possible models. The likelihood isn't really any different than the probabilities we've been working with so far, except that we don't know which of the hypothetical bags is the right one. The likelihood is the probability of observing an outcome supposing for the moment that one of our given models is the correct one. In that sense, the likelihood is a hypothetical or a conditional probability for one of our several possibilities under consideration. Since each model is equally plausible at the outset, let's think about the results we might get if we performed 100 experiments with each hypothetical bag of marbles. If we drew out a marble from the bag with 1 blue and 3 red marbles, wrote down what color it was, put the marble back, shook up the bag, and did the process all over again, we'd expect to get a blue marble about 25 times and a red marble about 75 times. This contingency table shows the number of marbles of each color we would expect to draw out if we tried this 100 times with each of our hypothetical bags. Okay, now we know what we would expect under each of our possible scenarios. Let's collect some actual data. We'll draw out a marble from the actual mystery bag, and we get a blue marble. Given that we know that there's at least one blue marble in the bag, is it at all plausible that the bag contains only red marbles? Of course not. Even though each model was equally plausible before we drew out any marbles, we now know that the first model, the one with all red marbles, couldn't possibly be true. What about the remaining models? How plausible are they now? In our imaginary experiments with each hypothetical bag, the last bag with all 4 blue marbles produced the most imaginary experiments with a blue marble outcome. Given that we drew a blue marble from the real bag, it's most plausible that the bag contains all blue marbles. It isn't certain, of course. The bag could also contain 1, 2, or 3 blue marbles. But it's much less likely that the bag contains only 1 blue marble, because such a bag is less likely to yield a blue marble on the first draw. Drawing out our marble gave us some information about what's in the bag, but we could really do with more information to distinguish between the remaining possibilities. Let's put the first blue marble back in the bag, shake it up, and draw a second time. Just as before, we can make a table of what we would expect from 2 draws from each of our models. If the bag has 1 marble and 3 red marbles, out of 100 trials, we'd expect that 38 of them would give us a red and a blue marble, and we'd expect 6 of them to give us 2 blue marbles, and so forth. Now that we know what we would expect for 2 draws from each of our hypothetical bags, let's collect some more actual data. We'll draw a second marble from the actual mystery bag, and we get a red marble. Now that we've drawn both a blue marble and a red marble, is it at all plausible that the bag contains all blue marbles? Nope. Even though that bag was most plausible after the first draw, now that we have new information from our second draw, that model is no longer plausible. The bag could still contain 1, 2, or 3 blue marbles. Out of our imaginary experiments, which bag produced the most trials with 1 red and 1 blue marble? It was the bag with 2 red marbles and 2 blue marbles. That bag is the most plausible based on the information we have now after 2 draws. Let's try this one last time. We'll put the second marble back in the bag, shake it up, and draw out a marble a third time. Here's the table of what each hypothetical bag would produce in our imaginary experiments with 3 draws. Drawing out of our mystery bag for a third time, we get a blue marble. Thinking about the imaginary experiments, which bag produced the most experiments with 2 blue and 1 red marble? It was the bag that had 3 blue and 1 red marble. Given our new information, this is the model that's most plausible. The bag with 2 blue and 2 red marbles is also fairly plausible, and the bag with 1 blue and 3 red marbles is possible, but not nearly as plausible as the other 2. The green graphs in the lower right have shown how plausible each model was after we observed some actual data from the mystery bag. These distributions are called the posterior. The posterior distribution is the plausibility of each model after observing some data. It's the conditional probability of the model given the data. Notice that this conditional probability is flipped from the likelihood. The likelihood was the conditional probability of the data given a particular model. That is, we supposed for the moment that a particular model was true and asked, what data would we get? The posterior, on the other hand, is the probability of a model given some data. That is, suppose we know some information about the bag, which model is most likely to be plausible? Okay, let's step back and have a quick review of what we did. We started with the question, can we determine the composition of our mystery bag based on what marbles we pull out? We thought up all the possible contents of the bag. These were our 5 models. Then we thought about what would happen if we drew out 3 marbles from each of these hypothetical bags, replacing the marble and shaking up the bag each time. These conditional probabilities of each possible outcome given one of our hypothetical bags were called the likelihood. Based on the likelihoods, we conducted an imaginary experiment in which we drew 3 marbles out of each hypothetical bag 100 times. We used each hypothetical bag the same number of times because our prior distribution, that is the plausibility of each model before we observed any data, followed a uniform distribution. Each model was equally plausible. Combining the likelihood and the prior in this way gave us a 2-way contingency table of our imaginary experiments. This is called the joint distribution of the model and the data. Notice how the joint distribution is an application of the multiplication rule. The probability of the model and the data is the conditional probability of the data given the model times the marginal probability of the model, that is, the prior. Then came the moment of truth when we actually drew out our marbles from the mystery bag. Once we found 2 blue and 1 red marble, we went back to our imaginary results and focused just on those imaginary outcomes that matched our actual results. That is, we were interested in the conditional probability given the data we observed. We were limiting our sample space just to those outcomes that matched our actual data. This conditional probability of the model, given some observed data, is called the posterior, and the posterior tells us how plausible each model is based on the information we gathered. This equation here for the posterior is what we'll use for statistical inference. It's how we'll draw conclusions based on our limited information. When we're considering several possible models for the world, such as obesity rates, it's this equation that will tell us how plausible each model is, given the information we have available. This equation is called Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem says that the conditional probability of the model given some data is equal to the conditional probability of the data given a hypothetical model times the probability of that model divided by the probability of the data. Another way of saying this is that the posterior is equal to the likelihood times the prior divided by the probability of the data. Bayes' theorem is simply an application of the definition of conditional probability combined with an application of the multiplication rule. We use Bayes' theorem because we want to find the posterior, the probability of the model given the data, but it's typically easier to state the likelihood, the probability given the model. Bayes' theorem combines the likelihood for each of our hypothetical models with how plausible each of these models was before we observed any data, that is the prior. And it restricts our focus just to those imaginary outcomes that match the data we actually observed. This told us how plausible each model was after taking into consideration the new information. So in summary, we considered a mystery bag that contained 4 marbles, some of which were red and some of which were blue. We asked the question, can we determine the composition of the bag based on what we draw out? Each time we drew out a blue marble, it increased the plausibility that the bag contained a lot of blue marbles. And each time we drew out a red marble, it increased the plausibility that the bag contained a lot of red marbles. Bayes' theorem told us how plausible each model was given the information that we observed.